on the surface, the great difference between the resurgence in India and in China is that China has had a revolution and India hasn't. And yet, that would be a superficial impression. In India, too, revolutionary changes have been taking place. But in the vulgar mind, revolution is inextricably associated with violence. In that sense, we have had no revolution. Occasionally, we too used to indulge in a little violence. We too did a little bit of bloodletting. But it was our own blood that we shed, the blood of our own brethren, Hindus and Muslims, not the blood of our rulers. And so, on the whole, India may be said to have risen to independence without violence. Of course, for this, the thanks go primarily to Gandhiji. He was, as I said yesterday, a disciple of the Gita, the Bible, and Tolstoy's teachings. Once I visited Tolstoy's library in Yasnaya Polyana, and there I saw a book called Gandhi in South Africa by one Reverend Dawkes. Tolstoy had evidently read it most carefully. From the manner he had sidelined it, underlined it, annotated it. One passage which struck him particularly was this. That was a favorite Gujarati song of Gandhiji's. It runs thus: if you give a glass of water to a man who gave you a glass of water when you were thirsty, there is no merit in it. But there is merit in returning good for evil. And against it, Tolstoy had written, this is the height of wisdom. It is the same as Christ's teaching to turn the other cheek to your enemies. That is something to which no communist can rise. Not even a communist like Khrushchev. I say not even because I regard Mr. Khrushchev as the sanest, the wisest, the most objective, the least dogma-ridden of communist leaders. Once Mr. Khrushchev visited France as the guest of President de Gaulle. There he met a padri with leftist tendencies, and they had an argument about Christianity. The padri said that after all, there was a great deal in common between communism and Christianity. Both stand for the common man. Both believe that it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the gates of heaven. Why then don't you accept Christianity? Asked the padri. Khrushchev said he had no special quarrel with Christianity. Christ said many wise, good, and sensible things. Only, said Khrushchev, he drew the line when Christ said that you must turn the other cheek to your enemies. If someone were to smite me on one cheek, he said, I would chop his head off. Of course, Mr. Khrushchev was exaggerating. Otherwise, Mr. Molotov, Mr. Malenkov, and Mr. Kaganovich would not be alive today. He has stopped the habit of chopping off the heads of your opponents. But that is a game in which his predecessor indulged. He did not hesitate to chop off the heads of his opponents by the 100, by the 1,000. And the Chinese communists, too, have not shown much compunction in doing so. So Mahatma Gandhi was largely responsible for the fact that India became independent without resorting to violence. But the credit must also go to Britain, to the sanity of Britain. British conduct in the concluding stages of her rule in India was very different from that of the Dutch in Indonesia or the French in Indochina. We know how the Dutch resorted to a police action, how this roused the anger of all Asia and Africa, and how an impressive conference of the heads of Asian and African states was held in New Delhi in 1950. We also know that the French fought to the bitter end in Indochina until they were disastrously defeated at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, where 4,000 brave French soldiers lay dead on the battlefield, and 8,000 were wounded and taken prisoner. And the French repeated this gruesome operation for 8 years in Algeria, until that was wound up by the firmness and the sagacity of de Gaulle. India did not have to go through a bloodbath as these countries had to. The parliamentary system of Great Britain, too, is partly responsible for the fact that India became independent without inflicting the kind of humiliation which France and Holland had to suffer. As you know, during the war, the British Prime Minister was a great leader, a great war leader, one of the greatest the world had seen. But like most great men, he had one blind spot, and that was India. To the end, he was implacably opposed to Indian independence. Some of the things he said we cannot forget, though of course we have forgiven them. To him, Gandhiji was just a second-class seditionist lawyer from the Middle Temple. In 1930, when Mahatma Gandhi went to the Viceregal Lodge at the invitation of that Christian Viceroy, Lord Irwin, Churchill scoffed at the spectacle of the naked fakir striding up the steps of the Viceregal Lodge. During the last war, he refused to define the war aims, lest the pestilential Americans should trouble him about the independence of India. He deliberately excluded India from the scope of the famous, but to us fatuous, Atlantic Declaration. He stuck to this attitude right to the end of the war. What we have, he said, we hold. I have not been called upon, he said, to become First Minister of the Crown to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire. But within 5 years, the empire was liquidated. Not only the empire, Mr. Churchill himself was liquidated, politically liquidated for a period of 5 years. The British electorate turned out a government which had indeed brought them victory, but which threatened to rob Great Britain and the world of the fruits of victory by sticking to the old imperialist methods. There came a government thanks to the parliamentary system of England, a government which was pledged to give independence to India. 5 years later, Mr. Churchill came back to power. By that time, the independence of India was an accomplished fact. Again, it is a tribute to the parliamentary system of England that Mr. Churchill, who had been such an enemy of Indian independence, now not only acquiesced in it, but accepted it gracefully. Srimati Indira Gandhi told me that once she happened to be sitting next to Mr. Churchill at a banquet. Mr. Churchill was in an expansive mood. I suppose it must have been after brandy and cigar. Isn't it strange, he said, that you and we should have been such enemies and now we are such good friends? Oh, Mr. Churchill, said Mrs. Gandhi, I never thought of you as an enemy. Mind you, I did, said Mr. Churchill with characteristic candor. Now, Mr. Churchill cannot turn his other cheek to his enemies any more than Mr. Khrushchev can. But both can recognize when an enemy ceases to an enemy. Both have the great gift of looking facts in the face and adjusting their policies accordingly. Thus, I think we can say that India became independent without violence thanks to the idealism of Mahatma Gandhi and the realism of Great Britain. The British occupation of India, too, was different from the occupation of some other countries of Asia. Great Britain did indeed exploit India, but she was also proud of India. India was the brightest jewel in the British crown, and Great Britain at least kept its surface polished and took a pleasure in exhibiting it to the world. At least Britain prevented other powers from exploiting India. That was not the fate of China. Traders from different countries, a whole group of countries, including, alas, an Asian country, descended on China and exploited her to their heart's content. Normally, they vied with one another. They competed with one another. Sometimes they even fought one another. But when it came to a pinch, they stood together. For instance, they helped the decadent Manchu Empire to crush the rebellion of the Taipings. The Taipings had promised to offer, there was hope that the Taipings would give China a clean and progressive government. And the head of the Taiping movement was a Christian. He said that he received revelations directly from God. But that itself was an offense. If only Mr. Hung, writes Fitzgerald, the wise historian of China, if only Mr. Hung had allowed himself to be baptized by some Reverend Smith and sat at his feet studying the tenets of Christianity, Mr. Hung would have been accepted into the Christian fold. For God, says Fitzgerald, for in Europe, God acts only, for in Asia, said Fitzgerald, God acts only through the medium of Europeans. Again, during the Boxer Rebellion, all these powers combined and inflicted a heavy indemnity on China, which she continued to pay until 1940. The Americans, to their honor, turned this indemnity into scholarships for Chinese students. And there grew up a whole generation of Chinese students trained in the American way of life. And one of their teachers, Dr. Leighton Stewart, he was the American ambassador in China when I was there. Every now and then, at that time, communism had not come, but communism was coming. Every now and then, someone would go and report to Dr. Leighton Stewart that such and such a man had become a communist and had committed such and such atrocities. Oh, it cannot be, Dr. Leighton Stewart would say, it cannot be, he was my student. During the last war, America was China's best friend. And it is a tragedy that America should now have become China's enemy number one, a position for which we too seem to have a certain claim. For the first time in 4,000 years, China has swooped down on us. But there has been a difference. While China has not dared to attack Formosa or even the offshore islands, which are protected by the might of America, she has, with that courage characteristic of a bully, swooped down on unsuspecting and therefore unprotected India. This is a new phenomenon in Sino-Indian relations. Of course, we have had examples of it in world history, but we thought that this had become a thing of the past with the passing of Hitler. So, in standing up against China, we feel that we are standing up against a menace, not merely to India, but to all the neighbors of China, great and small, a menace to Asia and the world. In her expansionist urge, China does not seem to make any difference between friend and foe. Towards the West, of course, her attitude is one of implacable hatred. We have been under the West, but we do not harbor any such hatred against the West. That's partly because Gandhiji was never tired of telling us that you should hate oppression but not the oppressor. We have not thought it necessary to cut ourselves adrift from the stream of European influence, which, as I said yesterday, has had a good influence on certain aspects of our society. Freely and voluntarily, we have agreed to remain in the Commonwealth of Nations. That has not made any difference to India, but it has made a difference to the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth of Nations is no longer the British Empire, as Mr. Churchill insisted on calling to the bitter end, nor the British Commonwealth of Nations, but just the Commonwealth of Nations. Each country is at liberty to follow its own internal and external policy. All that binds the members is respect for certain values in public life. And when one of these members, South Africa, brazenly flouted those values, it was shed from the Commonwealth like a diseased limb. On the whole, we have come to regard the British period in India as a short chapter in our long history, a chapter which has done us much good and much harm. We are under no compulsion to cast out the good with the bad. Our constitution is based on the British model. Of course, there are differences. The main difference is that we have a constitution and they haven't. The British constitution, said de Tocqueville, the British constitution, it does not exist. Though the constitution does not exist, they have developed certain constitutional practices and usages which we have adopted. We have adopted the parliamentary system of government. We do not regard parliament as a means for the oppression of the masses. We do not regard it as a tool in the hands of the exploiting bourgeoisie. In our country, the parliament is supreme. But here again, there is a difference. Our parliament is not quite so supreme as the British parliament. It has been said, I think it was Walter Bagehot, he said that the British parliament can do anything except make a man a woman or a woman a man. Our parliament, there are some other things which our parliament cannot do. It cannot pass any law in contravention of the fundamental principles. We have laid down certain fundamental principles in our constitution. They are justiciable. If any law is passed against them, it is open to a person or an institution to take them to court. In fact, it's a delightful chapter for the lawyers, the chapter on fundamental principles. It has become a happy hunting ground for lawyers. And legal ingenuity has often combined with the court's conservatism to hamper much needed legislation. But in the last resort, we can of course alter the constitution. Well, our judiciary again is based on the British model. Not merely our judiciary, but we have borrowed certain conceptions, certain legal conceptions, such as the rule of law. We jealously guard the independence of the judiciary. Our Supreme Court is supreme. Our High Court, according to a district judge in Madras, is even higher than God. In Madras, there used to be a district judge, a man called Roberts, who had a literary style. His style was too literary for him to get on to the High Court. He had to retire early, and he was my Tamil tutor at Oxford when I was undergoing probation in the ICS. He concluded a judgment in a murder case thus: Sessions judges' sentences of death passed by the Sessions judge have to be approved by the High Court. Mr. Roberts concluded his judgment thus: and I sentence the accused to be hanged by the neck till he is dead, 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 and may God have mercy on his soul, subject to the approval of the High Court. Well, so much for the legislature and the judiciary. The executive too functions more or less as in British days. Of course, in British days, the ICS was the mainstay of the government. It was, Mr. Lloyd George called it the steel frame of the government. The ICS has now no policy-making functions. When I entered the ICS, the number of Indians there was only about 150 or a few more out of 1,400. Then, under pressure of public opinion, the ICS began to be Indianized. Some departments were Indianized more rapidly than others. One of the departments which the British were very reluctant to Indianize was the one to which I belonged. They said that the princes would not like to have Indians as residents. The princes would not like their own countrymen to lord it over them as representatives of the paramount power. They also said that the wild, unruly Pathan will not bow his knee to the mild Indian, and especially the mild-mannered Hindu. It was my privilege to dispel these myths to some extent. The ICS, which was originally almost exclusively British, became increasingly Indian. This, of course, was the result of the constant application of pressure from the public. When the British left India, it was about 50-50. The British members of the ICS, when India became independent, they left India bag and baggage. That was a dangerous moment in India's history. India had been partitioned. There was a violent upsurge of communal passion. There were even wholesale massacres here and there. At that time, it was the privilege of a handful of Indian members of the ICS to hold the country together. And if chaos did not supervene in India, as it did in some of our neighboring countries, the credit should go to these men and to their political chiefs who splendidly supported them. And among the chiefs who splendidly supported them, none supported them more splendidly than the man in whose name these lectures have been instituted. And I am happy to have the privilege of paying a homage to his honored memory by delivering these lectures. Well, if then we have adopted the British Constitution, if our legislature, if our executive, and if our judiciary function more or less as they did in British times, how, you may ask, how can you say that in India there has been a revolution? The answer is that what counts is not the form of government, but the purposes for which government is used.